Kieran had always been aware that humans were a rarity in the Vathran system. Born on a small, unremarkable planet, he had grown up learning about the wider galaxy only through books, simulations, and the occasional holofeed of alien politics. Now, at 23, he was standing in the gleaming atrium of the Vathra Interstellar Council, surrounded by beings that seemed to defy imagination. Towering figures with translucent skin, others with 4 arms or wings that glimmered faintly, and a few whose features constantly shifted like living holograms. All of them moved with an air of elegance Kieran found both intimidating and mesmerizing. He adjusted the collar of his human uniform and reminded himself to breathe normally. This was no ordinary diplomatic meeting. Today, he would meet Prince Xyler, the 19-year-old heir of the Vathran monarchy, infamous across the system for his arrogance and sharp tongue. He had heard the stories. Xyler had insulted foreign diplomats, dismissed ambassadors with a single gesture, and reportedly humiliated scholars for minor mistakes. Kieran knew that whatever happened today, it would be memorable. The doors at the far end of the atrium opened, and a group of attendants swept forward, clearing a path for Xyler. The prince walked with effortless grace, his tall frame accentuated by robes that shimmered with colors impossible for human eyes to name. His gaze, sharp and calculating, scanned the room with an intensity that made Kieran feel as if he were under a microscope. Then, his eyes landed on Kieran. Xyler's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, and the room seemed to hush around them. "Ah," Xyler said, his voice melodic yet carrying an edge. "The human has arrived. How quaint." He tilted his head, examining Kieran as if he were inspecting a delicate artifact. "I hear you have traveled far from a world that still believes in simple tools and stories. How curious that you dare enter the halls of the Vathran elite." Kieran felt the weight of the insult, but he refused to respond. He had been trained for this, and one of the first lessons was clear. Anger or defensiveness would only make him predictable. Instead, he bowed lightly and offered a polite smile, keeping his eyes steady. Xyler raised an eyebrow, his amusement obvious. "No words? Humans are usually so talkative. Tell me, are you always silent in the face of mockery, or is this a special talent?" The prince's voice drew attention, and a few council members glanced toward Kieran, curiosity etched on their faces. Some whispered, their tones mingling awe with skepticism. Kieran's lips remained closed. He turned slightly and began to walk, not away from Xyler, but in a subtle circle that allowed him to observe the gathering without giving the prince the satisfaction of a reaction. Whispers filled the room, though many held their voices low, unsure whether the human's silence was confidence or fear. By the time Kieran stopped near a high balcony overlooking the cityscape of Vathra, Xyler had already moved closer. The alien prince's steps were deliberate, light, almost predatory, as though he expected Kieran to stumble or speak out of turn. "Interesting," Xyler murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "I expected fury, pleading, or at least a human attempt at wit. But you simply walk. How very human." Kieran did not reply. Instead, he looked out at the sprawling city beneath the balcony. Towers of crystalline metal caught the light of Vathra's twin suns, casting prisms across the streets below. Hovercrafts glided silently among skyways, and citizens moved with a fluidity and efficiency that made human technology seem clumsy in comparison. Yet even here, among beings and machines that seemed almost magical, Kieran noticed small imperfections. A hovercraft that faltered for a fraction of a second, a trader who miscalculated a trade route. Humans were adaptable. That thought had carried him across countless systems before. While Xyler relied on pride and inherited skill, humans relied on observation, patience, and ingenuity, and Kieran intended to prove that quietly. The gala continued, but Kieran remained in his quiet space, observing and noting. He saw diplomats struggle with alien customs, noble families jockeying subtly for influence, and scholars attempting to impress with overly complicated inventions. Every detail was an opportunity, a puzzle piece in the complex pattern of Vathran society. Hours passed, and Kieran moved among the guests with calm precision, greeting and thanking, asking questions, and listening more than speaking. Xyler, on the other hand, followed him at a distance, intrigued by the human's composure. He had expected tears, anger, or at least nervous chatter, but Kieran remained an enigma, a puzzle that could not be solved by insult or ridicule. At one point, a minor incident occurred. A tray of delicacies, a mixture of glowing fruits and crystallized proteins, was dropped near the prince, spilling across the marble floor. Aliens gasped, and attendants hurried to clean the mess. Kieran, without hesitation, bent down and carefully collected the fallen pieces, returning them to their tray. His movements were precise, almost elegant in their simplicity. Xyler's eyes widened slightly. The room held its breath. This was not an act of servitude or fear. It was competent, careful, and deliberate. Humans could be fragile, yes, but Kieran had just shown that they could also be attentive and efficient where even the Vathran elite might stumble. The night's formalities drew to a close, and Kieran found himself invited to a private observation deck to view the twin moons of Vathra. As he stepped onto the deck, the city lights below reflected in his eyes, and he could feel the weight of alien attention upon him. Xyler appeared beside him without a sound, his expression unreadable. "You intrigue me, human," the prince admitted after a long silence. "I have spent years surrounded by beings who either fear me or flatter me. You do neither. You are quiet, too quiet, perhaps." Kieran finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. "Silence is often more revealing than words." Xyler regarded him for a long moment. "Perhaps, or perhaps it is weakness." "Perhaps," Kieran said softly, "or perhaps it is strength." For the first time that night, Xyler smiled genuinely, if faintly. The prince realized that Kieran's power was subtle, not in weapons or magic or alien ability, but in composure, observation, and the quiet certainty that he did not need to prove himself immediately. As the twin moons rose higher, Kieran turned and walked toward the interior of the observation deck, leaving Xyler to stare after him. The young prince had expected a confrontation, an argument, or even a display of human inadequacy, but instead he was left with curiosity and a strange respect. The whispers of the gala, the laughter, and the critical stares had faded into the night. Kieran's steps echoed softly on the polished floor, each one a reminder that humans, though underestimated, carried their own brand of strength, one that did not need to shout or strike to be felt. As he walked, he thought of the coming days. There would be more challenges, more tests, and more eyes upon him. And Kieran knew he would face them all the same way he had faced Xyler's insult, with calm, observation, and the quiet patience that humans often mastered better than any alien race. Tonight had ended without drama, without confrontation, yet the seeds had been planted. In the quiet of his retreat, Kieran felt the stirring of opportunity. For humans might be small, fragile, and underestimated, but in that very underestimation lay their greatest advantage. And somewhere not far behind, Xyler watched, wondering what it would take to truly understand the human before him. The morning light in Vathra filtered through towering crystalline spires, painting the streets in shimmering patterns. Kieran walked among the early commuters, who moved with the fluid grace that marked the alien city. Yet he moved as humans had always moved, deliberately, observing, calculating, and taking note of small details others overlooked. He had promised himself that he would make these few days in the Vathran capital count. The gala had ended hours ago, but its echoes lingered. Kieran could feel it in the subtle glances cast his way. The quick discussions paused when he entered a room, the curious stares of aliens who could not comprehend why a human dared remain calm in the face of insult. Among them, Xyler's attention had not wavered for a moment. By mid-morning, Kieran arrived at the Vathra Science and Innovation Complex, a massive structure that combined elegance with function. The building seemed alive, with walls that shifted slightly to allow more light, corridors that adjusted their width for traffic, and displays of technologies that most humans could only dream of. Kieran had been invited to consult on a minor engineering project, though he understood it was more than that. It was a chance to observe, to demonstrate, and perhaps unintentionally, to teach the Vathrans something they had not expected from humans. The project involved the optimization of a city-wide energy conduit. Alien engineers had designed a system that was efficient, but with a flaw. Under certain rare conditions, the conduits could lose synchronization, causing brief but noticeable power fluctuations across entire sectors. To the aliens, it was a minor issue, almost trivial, but Kieran had learned long ago that minor flaws often revealed larger truths. He examined the designs, asking questions, noting measurements, and walking the length of the model conduits laid out in the simulation chamber. Several engineers hovered nearby, speaking quickly in their tonal language, filled with words humans could not fully pronounce. Kieran asked simple questions in his own tongue, but with the aid of a translator, he received answers, and slowly, piece by piece, he built a clear understanding of the system. Xyler appeared shortly after, slipping quietly into the chamber, as though he had been observing from the gallery above. He leaned against a railing, crossing his arms and watching Kieran with an intensity that made the human acutely aware of every movement. "I do not understand why they listen to you," Xyler said quietly to himself. "They have years of training, centuries of experience, and yet you stand here, calm, asking questions, and they follow you." Kieran did not respond. He had learned that attention was often more powerful than words, and Xyler was watching with full focus. Hours passed, and Kieran moved from observation to suggestion. He proposed minor adjustments in the conduit alignment, changes that seemed simple yet corrected the synchronization issue. He explained them without arrogance, demonstrating with diagrams and models. The alien engineers initially hesitated, their pride pricked by the human's audacity, but as each adjustment succeeded, their skepticism turned into reluctant admiration. Xyler's eyes narrowed. "The human fixes what we consider trivial, yet trivial it is not to him," he muttered under his breath. He had not realized that humans had a different perspective, one grounded not in inheritance or ceremony but in logic, patience, and adaptability. By midday, the minor energy fluctuations had been completely resolved. The engineers, exhausted but impressed, congratulated Kieran in their tonal language. He nodded politely, not seeking praise, and moved to the next station, a room of strategy simulations designed for urban planning. The exercise was supposed to be for young Vathran nobles, a way to learn control over resources and logistics. Kieran had been invited as a human observer, but he quickly realized that the simulation allowed more than observation. It allowed demonstration. The first challenge involved a simulated flood threatening a densely populated district. The alien plan was meticulous: evacuations, resource allocation, emergency construction, but it was rigid. Kieran noticed small gaps, bottlenecks in evacuation routes, delayed delivery of supplies, and miscommunication between simulated units. Quietly, he suggested alternative paths, minor adjustments in timing, and a slightly different distribution of resources. The simulation responded immediately. Efficiency improved, residents were safer, and resources were conserved. The room was silent for a moment, then erupted into cautious applause. The nobles, used to being the most adept in such exercises, stared at Kieran with a mixture of shock and begrudging respect. Xyler stepped forward. "You make it look so simple," he said, his voice low, almost teasing but carrying an undercurrent of curiosity. "Simple, yet effective. Why do you do this?" Kieran paused, thinking carefully. "Because humans cannot rely on inheritance or ceremony alone," he said. "We survive by seeing what others overlook, by thinking in ways others do not expect. Strength comes from adaptability." The prince considered this, his expression thoughtful. Humans, in the stories he had been told, were small, fragile, and often reckless. Yet here was Kieran, calm, precise, and quietly correcting mistakes that aliens with centuries of experience had overlooked. For the next several days, Kieran's presence in the city became a quiet storm. He moved from engineering rooms to trade negotiations, from strategy simulations to diplomacy sessions, each time observing first, then offering subtle adjustments that improved outcomes. At a trade negotiation involving rare minerals, Kieran noticed that one alien faction relied heavily on assumption rather than verification. They would have accepted a deal that heavily favored their side but risked long-term instability. Kieran proposed a small recalibration, adjusting the trade ratios slightly while ensuring long-term fairness. The negotiation concluded successfully, with alien diplomats whispering about the human's unusual insight. Xyler, who had been observing, could not hide his fascination. "Why do you do this, human?" he asked once again during a quiet moment in the observation gallery of the trade chamber. "You could dominate, flaunt, or seek recognition, yet you quietly correct, suggest, and improve." "Why not show power?" Kieran looked at him, eyes steady. "Power without purpose is fragile. Influence is stronger when it is earned quietly. Humans are patient. We know that time and observation are more powerful than immediate force." The young prince frowned, not in anger but in puzzlement. He had been trained to assert, to dominate, to be seen as superior. And here was a human showing that influence could come without conflict, that respect could be gained without intimidation. Later, Kieran found himself invited to a private garden, a serene area high above the city, filled with alien flora that glowed softly in colors his eyes struggled to name. Xyler joined him, silent for a long while, watching the human move among the plants, observing the delicate balance of light and shadow. "You have changed the opinions of many," Xyler said after a moment. "Even my advisors whisper your name, often in astonishment. Yet you remain calm. Is this human nature or merely your own temperament?" Kieran smiled faintly. "Perhaps both. Humans learn to adapt, to survive in conditions harsher than these. We have learned patience, observation, and quiet persistence. It is not always celebrated, but it is effective." Xyler's gaze softened slightly. "I underestimated you," he admitted. "I thought humans weak, small, inconsequential, and yet, here you stand, correcting what I thought unfixable, showing insight beyond your years and experience." "You are remarkable." Kieran nodded politely, not seeking praise. "Thank you, but insight is meaningless if it is not applied. Humans measure success not by strength alone, but by usefulness and impact." The prince studied him in silence, and for the first time the sharp edge of arrogance that usually defined Xyler seemed tempered by curiosity. He had expected conflict, confrontation, or humiliation. Instead, he had found competence, calm, and quiet authority. Over the following days, Kieran's influence continued to grow, not through overt displays of power, but through careful observation and thoughtful action. Alien engineers adapted to his suggestions, noble families began consulting him on minor matters, and even Xyler found himself seeking Kieran's quiet guidance on strategy and problem-solving. One afternoon, a minor crisis occurred. A simulation of citywide energy distribution revealed a potential failure in a new sector. Engineers panicked, attempting to apply complicated protocols that only worsened the problem. Kieran calmly assessed the situation, tracing the flaw through logic and observation. In a matter of minutes, he suggested a simple realignment of conduits, resolving the issue. The result was immediate and undeniable. Aliens who had doubted him now looked at Kieran with respect. They could not understand fully how a human, considered weaker and less capable, had outmaneuvered them without confrontation, without intimidation, without even raising his voice. Xyler, observing from the gallery above, allowed himself a small smile. For the first time, he admitted to himself that humans might possess a type of strength that Vathrans had never valued: quiet intelligence, adaptability, and moral composure. As evening fell, the city bathed in the glow of twin moons. Kieran walked once more through the streets, noting details, observing citizens, and reflecting on the events of the past days. He had not sought attention, nor had he tried to prove anything. Yet in every silent action, every small solution, every careful observation, he had begun to reshape the opinions of those around him, including the heir to the Vathran throne. Xyler followed at a discreet distance, no longer with the expectation of confrontation, but with the curiosity of one who watches a new and unpredictable force. He had been certain that he would humiliate this human. Now he wondered how much more Kieran could teach him, if he could learn humility in the process. And in the quiet glow of the Vathran night, Kieran understood the truth of his own existence among the stars. Humans were often underestimated, dismissed, and overlooked. Yet in that very underestimation lay their greatest advantage. Observation, patience, and quiet intelligence could achieve what arrogance and inherited skill never could. And somewhere not far behind, Xyler watched, realizing that this human's influence was growing, not through power or dominance, but through the quiet, unstoppable force of human ingenuity. The day began quietly, with the soft hum of Vathra's energy grids filling the palace halls. Kieran moved through the corridors with calm purpose, as he had during the past week. Yet today was different. Rumors had reached him that Prince Xyler, intrigued and unsettled by the human's quiet influence, had prepared a private challenge, a contest of skill, intellect, and adaptability. The prince's curiosity was not idle. He wanted to understand the human fully, to measure the depth of Kieran's abilities. Kieran did not fear it. He had faced far greater challenges in far smaller spaces, where humans had survived against odds that seemed impossible. What mattered was observation, patience, and precise action. And Kieran had all three. He arrived at the observation chamber, a massive circular room perched high above the city. The floor was a lattice of polished metal, reflecting the twin suns of Vaethra, while the walls projected holographic grids, simulations, and interactive challenges. At the center stood Xyler, eyes sharp, waiting. Around him were other observers, alien nobles, engineers, and scholars, all whispering quietly about the human who had quietly redefined their understanding of intelligence. "You understand the rules," Xyler said, his tone calm but commanding. "This contest is simple, problem-solving under pressure. You may use logic, observation, or innovation. You may not interfere with others' work. The one who solves the most challenges correctly and efficiently is the winner." Kieran nodded. "Understood." The first challenge appeared instantly, a holographic representation of a city under environmental stress. Storms swept through sectors, energy grids fluctuated, and communication lines flickered. The Vaethran plan was already simulated, intricate, precise, yet rigid. Engineers had built failsafes, but there were gaps they could not predict. Kieran studied the simulation, noting the small weaknesses. Where the storm would overwhelm the northern energy conduits, he rerouted surplus energy from the south. Where communication lines risked failure, he suggested a temporary relay system using mobile drones. Where evacuation routes could bottleneck, he applied simple timing adjustments to stagger civilian movement. Each adjustment was subtle, precise, and efficient. The simulation responded immediately. The city stabilized, resources were preserved, and the holographic residents moved safely through the streets. Observers murmured in astonishment, noting the speed and elegance of the human solutions. Xyler's eyes narrowed. He had expected mistakes, hesitation, or a display of nervousness. Instead, Kieran had already corrected issues the Vaethrans themselves had overlooked. The second challenge followed almost immediately. A complex negotiation simulation involving several alien factions, each with competing interests over rare resources. The Vaethran strategy relied on intricate, formal procedures and long deliberation. Kieran observed quietly, noting the small inconsistencies, the assumptions, and the overlooked dependencies. He spoke when necessary, offering simple suggestions that clarified misunderstandings, proposed fair redistributions, and ensured efficiency. The factions reached agreements faster than expected, and yet the results were equitable and stable. Observers, including Xyler, were stunned. The human's calm demeanor masked the sharp precision of his intellect. By the third challenge, Xyler could not contain his curiosity any longer. "How do you do it?" he asked, voice low, almost to himself. "How do you see the solutions that so many of us miss?" Kieran paused, then spoke simply. "We humans learn to adapt. We cannot rely on inheritance, size, or strength. We survive through observation, patience, and practical intelligence. Problems are not solved by tradition alone, but by thinking differently, calmly, and persistently." The prince considered this carefully. He had been trained to assert, to dominate, to know instinctively the right answers. Yet Kieran had shown that thought, patience, and insight could surpass instinct and inherited skill. The final challenge appeared. A simulated crisis across the city, combining elements from the previous challenges, environmental hazards, resource conflicts, and logistical failures. The room hummed with tension as observers watched. Xyler, usually so confident, now studied the human carefully. Kieran moved through the challenge methodically, identifying critical points of failure and proposing elegant, efficient solutions. He rerouted energy, coordinated resource allocation, and implemented communication and evacuation strategies that were both simple and effective. Each adjustment was precise, subtle, and efficient, resulting in stabilization of the simulation far faster than any previous attempt. When the simulation concluded, silence filled the chamber. Observers glanced at one another, unable to hide their amazement. Xyler stepped forward, eyes locked on Kieran. "You have surpassed what I expected," he admitted, his tone free of arrogance, yet tinged with genuine respect. "You do not act with aggression, nor with desire for attention, and yet you accomplish more than we do in hours with patience, observation, and quiet intelligence." Kieran smiled faintly, nodding. "Humans often succeed when underestimated. We cannot rely on physical dominance or inherited skill alone. Our advantage is adaptability and thought." The prince regarded him in silence for a long moment. It was clear that something had shifted, not in Kieran, but in Xyler. He had begun to see the human as a teacher, a model, and perhaps even a friend. The arrogance of youth and status, once so defining, had been tempered by humility and recognition of human strength. Later, as the sun set and the city below shimmered with twilight, Kieran walked through the observation deck. Xyler followed, not as a challenger, but as someone seeking understanding. The prince's expression was thoughtful, contemplative, and free of the arrogance he had carried for years. "You have changed my perspective," Xyler said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. "I believed humans weak, insignificant. I thought we, with all our technology and tradition, were superior in every way. And yet, here you stand, quiet, patient, and capable. You have shown that strength is not always visible, that intelligence is not always loud." Kieran nodded. "Strength can take many forms. Humans have learned that quiet observation, patience, and careful action often surpass immediate force or inherited advantage." The young prince studied him closely, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to assert dominance or impress. Instead, he felt curiosity, respect, and the desire to learn. "I wish I had learned this sooner," Xyler admitted. "Perhaps we have underestimated humans for too long. Perhaps we have much to learn." Kieran smiled. "Observation is the first step toward understanding. Recognition of others' strengths is the next, and then application is what truly matters." The evening passed with conversation rather than competition. Xyler asked questions not to challenge but to understand. Kieran answered, demonstrating insight not through pride or assertion, but through calm explanation and practical examples. By nightfall, the twin moons of Vaethra reflected softly on the city below. Kieran stood on the balcony, observing the lights, the movements of citizens, and the gentle flow of hovercrafts along the skyways. His thoughts were focused, not on praise, not on recognition, but on the quiet work of observation, understanding, and subtle influence. Xyler joined him silently, leaning against the railing. The prince's expression had softened completely, the sharp arrogance of youth tempered by awareness of human capability. "I will not forget this," Xyler said quietly. "You have shown me that humility, patience, and quiet intelligence are just as powerful, perhaps more so, than strength, status, or tradition. Humans are remarkable." Kieran inclined his head slightly, accepting the words without pride. "Humans have survived where others could not, often because we are underestimated. It is not always visible, but it is effective." For a long moment they stood in silence, watching the city glow beneath the twin moons. The challenges were over, yet the lessons remained. Kieran's influence had quietly reshaped the perceptions of the Vaethran elite. Respect had been earned not through confrontation, not through argument, but through observation, subtle action, and calm confidence. Xyler finally spoke again with a tone that carried genuine respect. "Perhaps we should study your methods more closely. Your way of thinking, it is unlike anything we have taught, and yet it works." Kieran smiled faintly. "Study, observe, adapt. These are human strengths. Anyone can learn them if they choose to see." The young prince nodded, thoughtful, as the city's lights flickered in the distance. "I think we have much to learn from you and from humans in general. I will not make the mistake of underestimating your kind again." Kieran walked back into the observation deck, leaving Xyler to watch after him. It was a quiet victory, one achieved without boast or confrontation, yet it resonated through the corridors of power in ways Xyler would not forget. Humans were underestimated, often dismissed, yet their strength lay in adaptability, intelligence, and calm composure. As Kieran disappeared into the interior of the deck, Xyler reflected on the week's events. The young prince had been taught arrogance, pride, and domination, but now he had learned humility, respect, and the subtle power of quiet observation. The lesson would stay with him far longer than any training, any ceremony, or any assertion of status. Kieran, meanwhile, remained unaware of the full extent of his influence. He had not sought recognition, nor had he sought to change minds deliberately. He had acted as humans always did, observing, understanding, and applying insight where it mattered most. And in doing so, he had reminded a young prince, and perhaps an entire civilization, that true strength often lies not in what is visible, but in what is understood, anticipated, and applied with patience and care. As the night deepened, Kieran walked toward his quarters, the twin moons casting gentle light on the city. Somewhere behind him, Xyler continued to watch, contemplating the lessons of patience, humility, and human ingenuity. The story of the insult, the quiet retreat, and the subtle victories had ended, but its impact would echo through Vaethra for years to come. Humans, underestimated as always, had quietly changed the game.